Okay, I'm going to introduce you to Enfys McMurry, and she's going to talk about the next two places that we stop. The first is Jesse Beck, and the next will be Iowegian de Mueller.
Thank you very much. Okay, everybody. A lot of you have asked me about when my book will actually appear on the market, and it's completely in the hands of the publisher and the printer. And what they're telling me now is the last couple of days of November. So I'm telling people roughly November the 30th, and the title of the book will be Centerville, a Mid-American Saga. And when you turn to the first page, you will find that I have dedicated the book to this man, Jesse Beck, without whose journalistic skills this book would not have been possible. Now, he was not originally a native of this area. He was born in a tiny community called Fremont, not to be confused with Fremont County, but a little community called Fremont, which is just north of Hedrick, which is just north of Ottumwa. He arrived in Centerville in 1903. In between that time, he had acquired a degree, and he had become fascinated with journalism. And he had married, and he had 3 small boys, and he arrived to buy the semi-weekly Iowegian with his brother-in-law, John Needham. He arrived on a hack into Mystic and then into Centerville, which then was a sea of mud. And it's in 1903 that a remarkable committee is established in this community, which was called the Reform Committee, and they just passed one law after another about the cleanliness of the town, and sewer systems and road systems, and the courthouse was built that year, the post office was built that year. He arrives just before that was all happening. So now let's take the date 1903. 1903 until 1946, which is when Jesse Beck retired. In fact, in his office just off the square on North Main Street on the left-hand side as you're going down from the square, Jesse Beck in 1945 decided to retire with quietness and his usual dignity and what some people said was a little bit of coldness. He just waited for the door to open, and his son, Bob Beck, who many of you will remember, had just come home from the Second World War where he had served in the U.S. Navy. And Robert Beck walked in through the door without fuss, without fanfare, took the pen from his father's hand, and took over as editor of the Iowegian. And if Bob Beck were here, he told me, and I know he would give me permission to repeat it, I was never the journalist my father was. In fact, I doubt if anybody was a journalist, Jesse Beck was. Jesse Beck was utterly communicative and disciplined to tell the story of everything that was happening in this community, everything. And think of the time he lived through. From 1903, he's going to live through race relations, which are going to be critical in the town. He's going to live through the First World War, the Second World War he's repeating. He's living through the Depression. He's writing about the Ku Klux Klan. He's writing about the horrendous crime that broke out in the town right after World War I. He's writing about Prohibition. And then at the end of Second World War, and one writer out west who is a history writer, and he's from Mystic, and he insisted I read every chapter of my book to him, and I was so grateful because he's an expert on the Second World War. And because I'm British originally, I'm an American citizen, don't worry now, so I'm perfectly human, right? But I grew up during the Second World War, and I really knew very, very little about what was happening on those Pacific islands. We'd heard names like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but we really didn't know what was going on. Our focus was Europe. So here, as Jesse Beck is doing this, the history writer out west says, Enfys, I was scared in my life that you were going to rewrite the history of the Second World War. I think Gary Craver thought I was, right? But I had to give enough about the Second World War for you to understand where 110 men from this county died on those islands in the Pacific and in Africa and in Europe. So I give you the name of every single one. I was scared to death that the history press would slice them out, because everybody at the University of Iowa Press wouldn't touch my book because they said it was too long. And they referred me to history press, so then I was afraid that they were going to axe, because I was going way, way over the number of words in the contract that I was supposed to adhere to. History press haven't cut out a word. So all the story of those boys who died in the Second World War, every single one of them will be in there. But before that, let's go to Jesse Beck. You see, this man just didn't report. This man was a moral guide for the compass, but he didn't preach. He didn't stand there and tell you what religion he was in and how you should vote and all the rest. You just picked it up from that man's discipline to tell the stories of this community. By 1903, what was happening? There'd been a Supreme Court case in which Clark versus Plessy had been ruled in 1896, which was separate but equal. So now people were coming up from the South, as they had done, especially African Americans, to join us because of the horrendous conditions under which they were living. And Jesse Beck doesn't preach about it. He simply reports. There was a famous trial in this town, an awful trial. It's all in the book. And you will be horrified, and at the same time you'll be encouraged as to how far as human beings, as Americans, we've come when it comes to race relations. There was a terrible case in Ottumwa. John Junkin, who had lived in Smoky Row and had been on every drug you wanted to name and in and out of prisons and foster homes and everything, had murdered a girl called Clara Rosine. Clara was on her way along Garter Street in Ottumwa to a meeting at the Methodist Church. She was white. John Junkin was black. He clearly raped her, and he clearly murdered her. There's very little doubt as you're reading all the accounts about it. Everywhere that John Junkin was taken, mobs tried to get in and murder him. And Judge Roberts in the state of Iowa said, we will move this trial to Centerville. And people said, why Centerville? And he said, it is a community that has never exhibited a mob mentality. The trial was at the courthouse, and it was 1912. And Jesse Beck was reporting. He reported it in detail and gave an account, horrific things being said. There were two men calling themselves early psychiatrists from Drake University. They stood up and they had John Junkin stand up in court, and they said, stand up. Everybody take a look at him. The length of his arms isn't right. The distance between his head isn't right. He's clearly a baboon. And if that shocks you, of course it does. And it shows the growth that we have come. Not quite there yet, but we're getting there. Jesse Beck reported it, and in his editorial at the end of the trial, when John Junkin was found guilty and he was taken for execution at Fort Madison, this man wrote an editorial. And in the editorial, he said that he urged the people in Appanoose County and anywhere to realize it was an individual who murdered Clara Rosine, not a race. 3 weeks later, there was an absolutely worse case almost that came to court, and this was a man from Appanoose County, and his name was John Junkin. He had sexually abused. You can use your wildest imagination. There are children present, and I don't want to use the four-letter word. To his 3-year-old niece. The child was nearly dying. She was in hospital. 3 doctors were working on her. And he went to court and, believe it or not, claimed he was innocent. And then he confessed something to his lawyer. The report is the lawyer went out of the room and vomited and came back in and said, I want to be withdrawn from this trial. At that point, John Hicks, who was the guilty person, stood up and confessed. Now, this is only a couple of weeks afterwards in 1912. This is still a young editor of the newspaper with Jesse Beck. And as he's writing the account of John Hicks's incredible trial and how he'd been sent now to Fort Madison for 12 years, Jesse Beck put a very interesting word in. He simply casually dropped the word that John Junkin was white. Just a year later, a man by the name of Ben Bagby in Creston was denied access to the horse track with his horses because he was a black man. And a Judge Toner in Des Moines ordered that Creston had to open up their course, and he said, remember, there is de jure, which is the law on the books, and in Iowa there was a law of equality on the books. And then, of course, there's the other kind of law, if not de jure, then de facto, which is how people behave towards each other. And again, Jesse Beck said Judge Toner in Des Moines used his heart and his mind correctly. You see, he didn't lecture so much as point out the constitutional basis on which we all live. So this man, I am incredibly grateful to him. I could not have done the book without him. He comes right up through time, but 22 years after that event is when Mr. Beck will really be tested. After the First World War, and he reports it in detail, I can say practically what battlefields the men were fighting and dying on, thanks to his reporting. And then at the end of the First World War, there's a crime wave sweeps the country. It is absolutely mind-boggling, the murders that were in this town alone. And the mafia moved in, calling themselves then the Black Hand, which is the early name for the mafia. One man was dragged up onto the railroad track, his throat, I'm trying not to say it, you're going to have to use your own imaginations. There were so many Sicilians and so many Italians in town. And remember, they came from a culture where all the responsible parties that were part of the law and order, you can say it that, in Italian and Sicily, were all hopelessly sold out. So they had formed the Black Hand in Italy and Sicily so that people had somebody to turn to for a course of injustices. That came into America. And then it changed into the mafia. All this, Beck was sitting in his office in the Iowegian and observing and reporting on it going on in the community. And at the end, of course, that organization known as the Ku Klux Klan decided this was the moment to save Centerville. So they used the excuse of the crime. But if you want to listen to a racist, it's never what they say. It's what you got to zero on the inside to find out what their real agenda is. A heck of a lot of people in Appanoose County fell for the KKK. There was a meeting of 6,000 up at Moravia where the mayor introduced the main speaker. There were 3,000 turned up at a meeting down in Exline. But slowly, bit by bit, the people caught on. And who get caught over in that? The people that haven't got the education, the people that are really basically racist anyway. But Jesse Beck just kept the reporting and the reporting. And finally, there was the showdown between the KKK, which had taken over the town. It had taken over the Republican Party and it had taken over the Democratic Party. There was absolutely no democratic way in which the people of the community could rise up and vote. So Jesse Beck and a group of men met together in a story that almost moves me to tears. People have even said, for goodness sake, send it to Clint Eastwood or somebody, right, to come and tell the story. Maybe Steven Spielberg would be a better example, right? So they had the meeting in May, and this man was leading it. And they formed a committee and they set up a secret organization. At first, they couldn't dare say it out loud, or the Ku Klux Klan would immediately march into the room and take it over. And they called themselves the Lincoln League. And that time, I don't know if it was deliberate or on purpose, but there are 6 pages of the Iowegian with an advertisement for a movie that was being held at the Majestic. 6 pictures of Abraham Lincoln, and the title of the movie was Lincoln, a Man for All Ages. And the first one, you know the statement. You can fool some of the people some of the time, and some of the people all the time, etc., etc. So, the Lincoln League won. Hands down, because people now could see through the KKK. It was the most wonderful moment in the history. And Jesse Beck's editorial, he said, let's all go back to business now and to our farms and to our ways of life and forget what has happened and move this community forward. At the end of our lives, and I'm getting there, don't we ask what we've stood for? This man stood for principles that I think was so exemplary, and I'm deeply grateful to him. Thank you.